Okay, we want to talk about how to stylize fonts within Vizrt T5. And what we're talking about here is basically a quick example. Like we have fonts and you can see that this font is extruded. It's got some textures on it and some materials as well, or some color, we should say. So how do we do this within Vizrt T5? Because the workflow is different than Vizrt T3. So when it comes to fonts and stylizing, essentially there are two things that we need to worry about: the classic mode and the Viz Engine renderer mode. So we're going to review twice how to stylize fonts in the classic mode, and then when you switch over to Viz Engine renderer, what is the difference and how do you get the textures? Number one, so we're going to just close this scene here and we're just going to discard that. We are left with a blank scene. We're going to switch over to the classic render mode in Vizrt T. And with this, we can use our classic regular fonts. So if you need to import a font, what you can do is go to your available docs here and go to the font management, and this little window will come up here, and we have a separate video on how to import fonts with that. So if you need to import fonts or get them actually into Vizrt T, you can watch that video. We're going to select a font here, and this is one of our classic fonts that we have imported. Now, for this to work, all we would need to do is drag that up into the scene tree there, and we have our font. And when we imported our fonts, it should have gave us a selection to blur some fonts and or create outlines. If we come into our font and right click on that font, we can also show blur fonts and show outline fonts. So if I'm going to do that, now we have some extra fonts, the blurred fonts and the outline fonts that also imported in with the font when we imported it. Furthermore, any font within the classic mode, we can double click on it and it takes us into the font editor. And from here, we can further manipulate it by using things like this blur setting. So we could come down and drag the blur on it and that would affect it. We have a vertex color, so we could change the color of it. We have contour, italic, outline, extrude. So we could change this within the font style editor and then save it and save that particular font, and it would be all set up. We're going to work within our font right here within the scene tree editor. Number one, I'm just going to go into the font editor here by clicking on that text icon within the container, and we can edit our font right within this edit box here. If we wanted to change the font, we could come down here and select this selector here and change it. There's a blur font that we could use. There's also an outline font. We'll just use the base normal font. Below that, we have things like word spacing, leading, tracking, and if you want to use these, make sure that your text is highlighted within the editor up here in the window, and then you can come down and use your different settings here. Otherwise, it may not work if it's not highlighted. We have other things like underline. We can turn the underline on here. We have a position and width for that underline, and we have our options for our geometry and whether we want to make it a texture, path, or razor. That's all optimization settings. And then we have our orientation settings down here that we can set by default, set to left alignment. We also have our shadow down here that we can turn on, and you can manipulate that further with your shadow, and then you have a color of that shadow as well. So if you want a quick way to create a drop shadow for your text, that's all within the editor here. Now if we want to take it further and texture this, we can use some regular textures from our asset database. So if we wanted to make this a metallic text, let's say, we could scale it up and then grab some type of image here and drop that on there. I'm going to go back into the text and turn that drop shadow off for a moment by selecting off. And you can see when we click on the texture editor here, we can go into the mapping mode and select our different options here. We have a vertex, we have a linear, we have a reflection. So we'll change it to reflection, and we also have our options to change that texture a little bit here with the position, X and Y, a rotation, and a scaling. And depending what we have it set to, some options may be grayed out and some may be available for you. We have it to reflection, and notice obviously the rotation is scaled out. Furthermore, we can use plugins to further manipulate this text. So for instance, we can drop an extrude plugin onto it. And we can go into the extrude plugin and choose our bevel type and our bevel size here. So since we are in the classic mode, one other option that you also do have are, of course, materials, and you can drop any type of material on this as well, and that will change the color of it. If you want to get rid of anything anytime from that container, you just slide that to the trash. Now, a couple other things that you can do to further manipulate this as we just scale this up a little bit here. One, we can use another type of image to create additional images on here. So for instance, I have a reflective image here that I want to use, and I'm going to slide this font as a sub-container of that image. If we click on that image to go into the texture editor, we also have the mapping here. I'm going to change that to reflection for the moment. And what I want to do is use this multi-texturing texture unit. I have my single texture highlighted. I'm going to turn on inheritable, and then underneath we have a texture unit. I'm going to change that to 2. And what that's going to do is take on both this blue reflective image and this other gray reflective image. And now I can come in and readjust my settings for this particular texture image here and set it where I want. Since we are in the classic mode, again, we have that option for our blurred and our outline fonts. So if I hold down Control and just click and drag, we can copy that font real quick, and we can come over to our font selector or our text icon here, and we can change that normal font to one of our outline fonts. And if we hide that font for a second, you can see that we now have an outline font. And if I wanted to change the image on that, I could swap that image out, and if I wanted to slide it outside of that container so that it doesn't take on that inheritable image, I can do that as well. So if we turn that back on, you can see that we have an outline font here with our base font filling in that outline. Now, if we needed to move these all together, we could highlight both containers here and then just group them and then throw them in a group. And when we rotate these and move them, we can now see that they're rotating and moving together. Now, if you had this set up within a scene, you would need to be careful, because when you go to change the text on one of them, it's not going to manipulate the other one as well. You would need a plugin for that. And if we go into our plugins and we look for a plugin called Text Link, we can link these two together. So we can slide this Text Link plugin up on one container, and when we click on that Text Link container, it's waiting for some blank boxes. So we just have to slide one of our other containers over there. And now whenever we text or type within one of our text boxes, everything is going to type with it. So achieving the look you want is all basically through the type of textures you're using at any time within the classic mode. You just swap out textures at any time to get a whole new look for your font. When it comes to fonts within the Viz Engine renderer mode, it's going to be a little bit different. And notice when we switch over right now to the Viz Engine renderer mode that none of those textures or images are going to work with this font. And you can see that our inheritable image here just shows up as a blank area. So if we are working in the Viz Engine render mode, we need to do the text a whole different way. So we're going to close this scene just by Xing out here, and we're going to start a brand new scene and make sure that we are in the Viz Engine renderer mode. Now, when we go into our asset view, we're going to look for an FF or a font face. And again, you can import your fonts through the available docs/font management window here. So make sure that we have some fonts imported within our folder here. And when we start working with fonts within the new Viz Engine renderer or Viz 5, we need to create our text this way via a plugin, and it's this text plugin. So we're going to drag that up into the scene tree, and when we click on it, it gives us the text editor. First, we need to select our font. So we're going to come down and select any font that we want, and we can type in our new font right up in the editor window. Now these fonts are going to work the same as far as the transformation editor goes. We have our position, we have our scaling, rotation, and everything is found within the transformation editor. If we go back into the text, we have some of the same settings that we had within the classic font. One thing that we'll want to do is, again, make sure that your text is highlighted up in the scene editor window, and that way we can now manipulate it further. One thing that we can do that we couldn't do within the previous version, within the classic mode, is use a color right within that font. So we can change that color right here. We also have the options for the effects. Again, we have a subline that we could turn on, and it would only affect the part of the font that we have highlighted. So we have an underline that we could use as well. I have some settings that we could adjust that underline bar if we wanted to. Further down, we have advanced styling. So again, as long as our font is highlighted, we can come down and use our percentages here to adjust our letter spacing. And if we did have that underline on up here, we have our underline settings down here that we could adjust even further with that underline. We'll take the underline off. Further down, we have our font effects and variables. And here it has that particular font that we're using within the scene. It names that here. So before, when we double clicked on the font within our asset view in the F tab, it brought up the font style editor. Now within Vizrt T5, we can access that right within the text editor here. So if I wanted to make this additionally bold, I could use that font effects variables down here within the text editor. We can also shear it down here. We can also scale it somewhat down here and offset as well. If you want to reset everything, you just double click on the variable there and that will reset everything. There's also a rendering, and by default it is set to razor. So when we change it to geometry, we get a whole other option down here. It creates a new window and we can open up that window, and within that geometry window we can enable the extrusion right within the text editor. Within the extrusion, we have the extrusion types that we can choose. So we can choose any icon here, and then we have our extrusion depth that we can choose, and you can somewhat see it within the font right now as we adjust the depth of it. And we have a bevel size as well that we can adjust. So that's just the start of the font. Now we may want to add some textures to it. And to do that, it's a different way than we did it previously within the classic mode. So now we're going to need another plugin. It's called a PBR material, and we're going to drag that up onto our text. And when we do that, it creates this little icon here, and we click on it, and it's waiting for some images to be dropped into these boxes. But before we do that, anytime we work within the Viz Engine renderer mode, one thing that we need to do is to create an environment. So we need to have an environment map in here. I'm going to go into my asset view and look for some type of image that is an HDR environment. Once you have one, import it into the system. One thing that you will need to do is to make sure that it's pre-filtered. So we have an image that we just imported here, this HDR image. But if we try to drag that in there, it's going to give us an error. It says an environment map needs to be. So if we right click on it, we can pre-filter any environment map, and it will give you a little naming convention here. We can click OK, and now it gives us this ENV at the top of this environment, and we can just drag that right into our environment map. We're going to go ahead and close that. Now at any time we could swap that environment map out with another one. Just make sure that it is pre-filtered. So we are going to close that environment map. Now we need to look for some PBR images. So I'm going to go over to my asset view again and try to find some PBR images that we can use for here. So I have a couple within my folders here, and you can see as I click through it, they're labeled concrete, fabric, a purple fabric, some gray bricks, and here we have some metal. So let's try the metal textures. Here's a metal panel. We'll try this one. So again, we're clicking on our PBR textures, and here's our boxes. So we need to drag these images into these boxes. And here's our base color image. So we're going to go ahead and drag that one up into the color. And here's our height. So we're going to drag this one into the height box. This is our metallic. We'll put that one into the metallic. Here's our normal. We'll drag that to the normal. And if you hover over any of these images, it will show you the real name, so you can know where you're dragging each one in case the name is a little short in the description down here. So here, as we click and drag and see, you can see that it's labeled roughness, so we're going to drag that roughness into that one. And then finally we have our ambient occlusion here that we can drop onto there. Now as we scale this font up here, we'll take a look and we can start to see some of the texture coming through. You can see it's a metal panel, and you can see some of the paneling here. If we go into the textures, we have our texture coordinates, which we can manipulate. We have a rotation, we have scaling factors, which we can scale up or down as well. Now fonts will also further be manipulated by the lights. So right now we have no lights in here, and we can turn on our default lighting setting right here within our scene by clicking this little default icon here. And when we do that, you can see how the texture really starts to pick up the lights here. And now you can start to see the texture of this metal plates that we dropped on our font. As we rotate around here, you'll be able to see a little bit better that texture and how it's picking it up. Now, as I mentioned, the lights, you can add lights to your scene, but we're just using the default lighting right now. So as you do add lights and different lights, it can affect this font differently. Now, one other thing that we can do with this font is if we wanted to combine images with it as well, we can do that kind of like the inheritable images before. However, we need to do it differently this time. We need to use a plugin called Texture Slot, and we're going to drag this texture slot right onto the container here. And when we do that and click on the texture slot, it takes us to the texture slot editor. Here, again, it's waiting for some type of image. So if we go back into our asset view, navigate to a folder where we have some images, we can drag an image up into this area here. So let's drag this gradient in here. And within this texture editor, we have a lot of different settings that we can adjust as well. We have a base color here under the target and an emissive. So whichever one you're using, you can select it, and then below that we also have a color blend mode. So we have our usual color blends here. If you're familiar with Photoshop, then you'll be familiar with these. We can come down here and try to change any of these and see what effect it has on the font. We also have a alpha blend mode. By default, it's on multiply. We can change these to several other options as well. There's also a blend factor, so you can blend that settings in or out. Below that, there's also some texture coordinates, which you can rotate, offset, scale, and pivot as well. You can rename this at any time if you want, and if we want to add more, we can. So if we just come up to the first selector here, we can type in a new name. This is a new one, we'll say. We could call it anything. We're just going to hit plus here, and it's going to add a new area for an image. And again, we can drag any type of image up into there. So we'll drag this blue one into there, or we can replace it with another one. We'll drag this flare into there, and then again we can come down to our color mode and start changing and selecting our different color modes to see what type of an effect it has on the font. And again, we have our scaling factors here that we can adjust, our pivot points and everything like that. So there are several different ways that we can manipulate our fonts using the textures and this texture slot. That's just a base font there, and then we could furthermore just keep going and try to stylize this further by copying this font and then swapping out one of our PBR images. If we go back into our asset view here, into some of our PBR materials, and if we come to our MD folder, you can see as we click through some of these folders that we have some of these compiled already. And here's a Metal 2 that I have compiled, and I'm just going to swap that out for that particular metal, and now we have a new font on top of it. We still have that texture slot on there, so if I wanted to get rid of one of those, I can. And then if I wanted to swap out that particular texture that's in there now, I can drag a whole new image in there. Let's say we just want to swap something out, something like that, and obviously we would need to change our settings down here, or you could try some other type of image and just keep swapping that out. If you don't want it, then you just get rid of it and or get rid of that plugin altogether there. But we do have another PBR material on here, so if we slide this font forward in Z space a little bit, you can see that that's a completely new type of texture on there. And we would need to go back into our geometry settings or our text shed settings, and we can adjust our extrusion depth or change our bevel size here to adjust that a little bit. And we have our two different fonts here. So now if you group them, you can move them all together as well. As we rotate these around, you can see kind of what's happening here with the texture that we created within our font. And again, by adding other things such as lights and or backgrounds to this, like for instance, if we added a set here, you can kind of see how this font is interacting with some other lights within the scene. So if we turn our default lighting off here, you can see that we have some lights set up within this scene already, and we can move our font around within this scene and see if those lights here will affect the fonts any further. So here you can see that we moved the fonts and we have two of these lights. So if we split our container here, which has our set in it, we have a set of lights here that we can come in and further adjust. We have our position, which we could change, and within the light settings here, you also have several settings. So right now it's set to point. We could change that to directional, spot, area, whichever light we want to use within the scene to further have it affect the font.